Rain poured relentlessly over Pike Place Market, drenching the cobblestone streets and the scattered onlookers who scurried for cover. In the middle of the chaos, Marley Finn stood under a dimly lit lamppost, clutching her weathered violin. Her fingers danced across the strings with practiced precision, pouring out a melody so haunting and beautiful it momentarily stilled the bustling world around her. The rainwater pooled at her feet, but she didn't flinch, not even when a gust of wind sent a chill up her spine. Music was her only refuge, her armor against the harshness of the world. Elias Hartwell, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, strode through the market with his 8-year-old daughter, Daisy. His umbrella shielded them from the downpour, though Daisy's small hand tugged insistently at his. "Daddy, wait!" she exclaimed, her voice a rare spark of excitement that caught Elias off guard. He turned, his stern expression softening slightly as Daisy pointed toward the lamppost. "What is it?" he asked, his tone clipped but curious. Daisy didn't answer. She broke free of his grasp and moved closer to the music, her bright eyes fixed on the woman who played as if the storm couldn't touch her. Marley's melody shifted, growing softer, almost like a lullaby. Daisy's small frame stood still, the rain soaking her boots as she listened with rapt attention. Elias approached briskly, his annoyance thinly veiled. "Daisy, come back, you'll catch a cold." "But Daddy, listen." Daisy's eyes gleamed with something Elias hadn't seen in months: joy. He sighed and finally allowed his gaze to drift toward Marley. Her tattered coat clung to her thin frame, and her wet curls framed a face etched with quiet resilience. She played without noticing the growing crowd or the curious onlookers who dropped coins into her open violin case. Elias frowned. "Come on, Daisy. We don't have time for this." He reached for her hand, but Daisy pulled away, her voice almost pleading. "Daddy, please, can we stay for one more song?" Marley caught the exchange out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't falter. Her bow glided over the strings with a precision that belied her obvious exhaustion. She played as though her very existence depended on it. Then it happened. A man in the crowd jostled forward, knocking over Marley's violin case and spilling the coins across the wet pavement. Marley froze for just a moment, the melody breaking as she looked down at her scattered earnings. Her shoulders tightened, but she quickly knelt to gather the coins, her fingers trembling from the cold. Elias stepped forward, his polished shoes splashing in the puddles. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, dropping it into the case. Marley's head snapped up, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. "I don't need your charity," she said softly, her voice firm but not unkind. Her pride, worn like a second skin, was evident in her tone. Elias arched an eyebrow, unaccustomed to such defiance. "It's not charity. It's compensation for the performance," he replied coolly. Marley hesitated, her fingers brushing the bill before she tucked it under her case with a sharp nod. As Elias turned to leave, Daisy lingered. She bent down, picked up a small daisy flower that had fallen from a vendor's booth nearby, and placed it gently on Marley's violin case. "Your music feels happy and sad at the same time," Daisy whispered before running back to her father. Marley stared after the girl, her heart tightening unexpectedly. She looked down at the flower resting atop the scattered coins, its petals bright against the gloom of the rainy street. For a moment, her hand hovered over it, as if unsure whether to accept the gesture. Elias glanced over his shoulder, his grip firm on Daisy's hand. "Let's go. We're late," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But as they walked away, Daisy turned back one last time, her eyes meeting Marley's with a quiet, unspoken promise. Marley stood frozen in place, rain dripping from her curls as she watched them disappear into the crowd. The haunting melody she'd been playing moments before echoed faintly in her mind, but now something else lingered. A faint spark, a sense of connection that had caught her entirely off guard. She plucked the flower from her case, twirling it between her fingers as the rain continued to fall. For the first time in a long time, Marley allowed herself to smile, even if only for a moment. The next morning, Elias Hartwell sat in his sleek, minimalist office, the rain from the night before still streaking the glass windows that overlooked downtown Seattle. His assistant stood at the edge of the room, briefing him on the day's meetings, but Elias wasn't listening. He turned a pen idly in his hand. his thoughts circling back to the haunting melody played by the street performer. Marley Finn. He hadn't even known her name until Daisy whispered it as they drove home. Daisy. She had been unusually quiet since breakfast, picking at her food with a faraway look in her eyes. The only time she showed any spark was when she mentioned Marley. "She made me feel something, Daddy," she had said softly, as if afraid the feeling might slip away if spoken too loudly. Elias sighed, setting his pen down. The last thing he needed was another distraction. But as the hours ticked by and Daisy's words lingered, Elias found himself standing abruptly and grabbing his coat. He didn't bother to tell his assistant where he was going. By mid-afternoon, Elias was back at Pike Place Market. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the damp chill of Seattle's early spring. He scanned the scattered stalls and street performers, his sharp gaze finally landing on Marley. She stood in the same spot, her violin tucked under her chin, her eyes closed as she played a tune that seemed to pull the world to a halt. Elias approached with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. As he neared, Marley opened her eyes, her bow hesitating mid-stroke. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by something sharper, wariness. "You again," she said, lowering her violin slightly. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it carried an edge, a warning. Elias straightened, his hands in his coat pockets. "You left quite the impression on my daughter last night." Marley raised an eyebrow, her grip tightening on the violin's neck. "And? Should I expect a thank you card?" Elias ignored the jab. "She won't stop talking about you. She hasn't been herself for months. Last night was the first time I've seen her smile in weeks." He paused, his voice lowering. "I need you to play for her." Marley blinked, caught off guard. "Play for her? You want me to—" "What? Make house calls like some kind of personal jukebox?" Elias's jaw tightened. "I'll pay you for your time, generously. Name your price." Marley let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Of course, money solves everything, right?" She slung her violin case shut with more force than necessary and began to walk away. "Wait!" Elias called after her. The urgency in his voice made her stop. She turned, her expression hardening. "Do you even know what you're asking me to do?" she said, her voice sharp. "You think you can just buy me, buy my music, because you have more zeros in your bank account than most people can count?" Elias stepped closer, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'm asking because my daughter needs you. I don't pretend to understand why, but she does. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help her." Marley studied him, her guarded eyes scanning his face as if searching for cracks in his polished exterior. For a moment, neither spoke, the hum of the market filling the space between them. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I'll do it," she said quietly, though her gaze didn't soften. "But not for your money. For Daisy." Elias nodded, ignoring the faint sting of her words. "Tomorrow, noon. Here's the address." He handed her a card before turning to leave. As Marley watched him disappear into the crowd, she felt the weight of the card in her hand and the pull of something she couldn't quite name. For years, she had played to survive, her music her only anchor. Now, it seemed, it had tethered her to a little girl who reminded her of a life she thought she had left behind. Marley arrived at the Hartwell mansion the next day with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Her worn violin case felt heavier than usual as she stepped into the sprawling foyer, where gleaming marble floors reflected the soft glow of an extravagant chandelier. The house was the epitome of wealth and detachment, its beauty cold and pristine like its owner. Elias appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. "You're punctual," he remarked, descending with measured steps. His tone was polite but distant, a thin veil over the skepticism that lingered in his gaze. "Didn't want to waste your precious time," Marley quipped, clutching the strap of her case. Her words had a bite, but her voice wavered slightly as she took in her surroundings. Before Elias could respond, Daisy's small figure emerged from behind a doorway, her face lighting up as she spotted Marley. "You came!" she exclaimed, rushing forward to grab her hand. Marley's tension eased as she knelt to Daisy's level, offering a warm smile. "I couldn't let my favorite fan down, could I?" Marley teased gently, earning a giggle from the girl. Elias observed the interaction silently, his expression softening for just a moment before he spoke. "The music room is this way. Daisy will show you." The music room was a stark contrast to the rest of the mansion. It was warm, with rich wooden paneling and shelves filled with books and sheet music. A grand piano stood in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Daisy pulled Marley toward a chair by the window, where the girl eagerly sat to listen. Marley unpacked her violin, feeling Elias's watchful presence like a weight on her back. She straightened, raised the instrument to her chin, and let the bow glide across the strings. The melody she chose was light and playful, designed to coax joy from Daisy's guarded heart. Daisy's smile grew as the music filled the room, her small hands clapping along to the rhythm. Elias stood by the door, arms crossed, his expression inscrutable. Marley could feel his eyes on her, a silent judgment that seemed to magnify every note she played. When the piece ended, Daisy clapped enthusiastically. "That was amazing. Can you teach me?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. Marley's brows lifted in surprise. "Teach you? Well, I suppose we could try something simple." Elias stepped forward, his voice cutting through the moment. "Daisy, let's not impose. Marley isn't here to be your teacher." Daisy's smile faltered, and Marley shot Elias a glare. "It's not imposing if I offered," she said firmly, her tone challenging. Elias raised an eyebrow. "I hired you to play music, not to disrupt routines or create distractions." Marley set her violin down with deliberate care. "And I agreed to be here for Daisy, not to entertain your ego. She wants to learn. What's so wrong with that?" The tension between them thickened, the air charged with unspoken words. Daisy, sensing the shift, looked between them with wide, uncertain eyes. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "I want to try." Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine, but don't let it interfere with her other responsibilities." Marley bit back a sharp retort, choosing instead to focus on Daisy. "All right, kiddo, let's start with the basics." The rest of the session passed in relative peace, with Marley showing Daisy how to hold an imaginary violin and practice simple bowing techniques. Elias lingered in the background, his gaze flickering between them as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. When it was time to leave, Daisy clung to Marley's hand, her eyes filled with reluctant gratitude. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked softly. Marley glanced at Elias, who gave a small nod. She smiled down at Daisy. "I'll be here." As she walked back through the grand foyer, Elias caught up to her. "You didn't have to challenge me in front of her," he said evenly. Marley stopped, turning to face him. "And you didn't have to make her feel small. She's a kid, Elias. She needs more than rules and routines. She needs someone to listen." Elias stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Marley," he said finally, his tone clipped as he turned away. Marley stepped out into the crisp evening air, her heart heavy with the weight of their clash. She glanced back at the towering mansion, its lights glowing like distant stars, and couldn't shake the feeling that she had walked into something far more complicated than she had anticipated. Marley's apartment was a world away from the grandeur of the Hartwell mansion. The walls were thin, the furniture second-hand, and the scent of rain clung to the old carpet. Still, it was her sanctuary, a place where she could exhale the tension that had clung to her since the encounter with Elias earlier that day. She placed her violin gently on the table, her fingers lingering on the case as though it might offer her reassurance. The soft knock at her door startled her. Visitors were rare and unwelcome ones even more so. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. Another knock, louder this time. She moved to the door, cracking it open just enough to see who was there. "Marley," the voice rasped. Her stomach twisted as she met the eyes of Russell, her foster brother. His face was worn, his hair unkempt, and the faint scent of alcohol clung to him. She didn't need to ask why he was here. She already knew. "What do you want, Russell?" she asked, her voice low but firm. He pushed the door open wider, stepping inside uninvited. "You don't call, don't check in. Guess that fancy violin gig has you thinking you're better than us." "I don't owe you an explanation," Marley snapped, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. She crossed her arms, blocking his path further into the apartment. Russell chuckled bitterly. "Always so high and mighty. Don't forget who took the fall for you back then. That's not fair, and you know it," she said sharply, her throat tightening. "I did what I had to do to survive, for both of us." Russell leaned against the wall, his gaze flickering to the violin case. "Yeah? And look where it got us. You scraping by with that violin, and me still cleaning up your mess." "Enough." Marley's voice cut through the tension, her eyes flashing. "If you came here to guilt me, you can leave. I don't have time for this." Russell smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You never did. But you always had time to run, just like you're doing now." He straightened, his tone turning colder. "You think these people you're playing for are any different? Rich folks like him, they'll chew you up and spit you out, just like everyone else." Marley's stomach churned. She hated how easily Russell's words wormed their way into her mind. "You don't know anything about them," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Russell tilted his head, a faint smirk on his lips. "Don't I? Bet that Hartwell guy doesn't know about your little history. What happens when he finds out, huh? You think he'll still let you play dress-up in his fancy house?" Marley felt the ground beneath her shift, her breath catching in her throat. "Get out, Russell." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, I'll go. But don't come crying to me when it all falls apart. You're good at running, Marley, but you're terrible at hiding." With that, he left, the door slamming shut behind him. Marley stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the window. She sank into the worn couch, her head falling into her hands. The weight of Russell's words pressed down on her, each one a reminder of the life she had fought so hard to leave behind. She had spent years building walls to keep the past at bay, but it seemed those walls were crumbling. Her gaze shifted to the violin case, the one thing that had always anchored her. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the strings. Lifting the violin, she rested it under her chin and let the bow slide across the strings. The melody that emerged was raw, aching, a wordless cry that filled the small apartment. As the notes faded into the stillness, Marley made a silent vow. She wasn't the girl Russell remembered. She wouldn't let him or anyone else drag her back into the shadows. She had fought too hard to let the past define her, but even as she steadied herself, a gnawing fear lingered. What would happen if Elias discovered the truth? Would he see her as just another broken piece in a puzzle he couldn't fix? Or worse, would he cast her aside just as Russell predicted? Marley shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Tomorrow she would face the Hartwell mansion again, but tonight she allowed herself the luxury of tears, her music weaving together the fragments of her resolve. The next morning, the Hartwell mansion was unusually quiet. Daisy sat cross-legged on the floor of the music room, a blank sheet of paper in front of her, and crayons scattered around her like tiny shards of color. Marley watched her from the doorway, her violin resting in its case, waiting to be tuned. The child had been uncharacteristically subdued during their last session, her usually bright chatter replaced by a quiet intensity as she worked on her drawing. Elias entered the room moments later, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. He glanced at Marley briefly, their silent truce from the previous day still intact. His eyes softened when they landed on Daisy. "What's this?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. Daisy didn't look up. "A surprise," she said simply, her crayon sweeping across the page with determined strokes. Her small tongue peeked out between her lips as she concentrated, and for a brief moment, Elias's face flickered with something almost tender. He crossed the room to stand near Marley, who stiffened slightly at his proximity. "She's been working on that for an hour," Marley murmured, keeping her voice low. "Said she wanted it to be perfect." Elias nodded, folding his arms. "She's never been this focused. Not since..." His voice faltered, the sentence hanging unfinished between them. Marley didn't press him. Instead, she turned her attention back to Daisy, who was now adding the final touches to her drawing. After a few more minutes, Daisy stood up, holding the paper close to her chest as she turned to face them. "Close your eyes," she demanded, her voice bright with excitement. Elias raised an eyebrow but complied, his posture stiff. Marley hesitated before following suit, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Okay, you can look now," Daisy announced. Marley opened her eyes first, and the sight before her stole her breath. The drawing depicted Marley playing her violin, a soft halo of yellow crayon radiating around her head. In the corner of the page stood Daisy, her small hands clapping, with a blue sky and green grass framing the scene. It was simple, childish, and utterly beautiful. Elias opened his eyes next, his expression unreadable as he studied the drawing. "You drew this?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Daisy nodded eagerly. "It's Marley's music. It feels happy and sad at the same time, like Mommy's favorite song." The room fell silent. Marley blinked, her throat tightening as she processed the child's words. She crouched to Daisy's level, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Daisy. This means more to me than you know." Daisy grinned, her face lighting up with pure joy. "You can keep it," she said, "so you don't forget me." Marley's lips curved into a bittersweet smile as she gently took the drawing. "I won't forget you, kiddo, not ever." Elias cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "It's a lovely drawing," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You did a good job, Daisy." The child beamed, basking in her father's rare praise. "Maybe I can make another one next time, a picture of all three of us." Marley and Elias exchanged a glance, the weight of the suggestion settling between them. Daisy's innocent comment had inadvertently drawn a line they hadn't been ready to cross, a fragile hope for a connection that neither of them fully understood yet. Marley tucked the drawing into her violin case, her fingers lingering on it as if to imprint the memory. "All right, Miss Artist," she said, her voice brightening. "Ready for your music lesson?" Daisy nodded enthusiastically, and the rest of the morning passed in a blur of laughter and off-key violin notes. Elias lingered by the doorway for most of the session, his presence a quiet shadow that neither intruded nor retreated. He watched as Daisy's laughter filled the room, as Marley patiently guided her small hands along the imaginary bow. It was a sound the mansion hadn't heard in a long time, something warm and alive. As the session ended, Elias approached Marley as she packed up her violin. His gaze lingered on the drawing tucked carefully into her case. "She hasn't been this happy in years," he said softly, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. Marley glanced at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "She's a special kid," she replied, her words deliberate. "She just needs someone to believe in her." Elias nodded, his expression thoughtful. For a brief moment, Marley thought she saw something shift in his eyes, something softer, less guarded. But the moment passed, and he stepped back, his usual demeanor sliding back into place. Marley left the mansion that day with Daisy's drawing safely nestled in her case. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel the faint stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. The possibility of belonging. Elias sat in his corner office, the panoramic view of Seattle's skyline stretching before him. The city bustled below, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Daisy's glowing smile as she presented her drawing to Marley. For the first time in months, his daughter seemed genuinely happy, and he couldn't deny Marley's role in that transformation. Yet, a lingering doubt remained, an unease he couldn't fully explain. The sharp buzz of his intercom broke his thoughts. "Mr. Beckett is here for your meeting," his assistant announced. Elias exhaled deeply, straightening his tie. Jonathan Beckett was a necessary evil, a business rival whose ambitions often towed the line between bold and underhanded. Beckett strode into the office with his usual swagger, a sharp smile cutting across his face. "Elias," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "Always a pleasure." "Let's skip the pleasantries, Beckett," Elias replied, his tone clipped. "What do you want?" Beckett chuckled, lowering himself into the chair opposite Elias. Direct as ever. "Fine. I hear you've been distracted lately. Something about a violinist." Elias froze for a fraction of a second before narrowing his eyes. "What are you getting at?" Beckett leaned back, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Word travels fast, my friend. A street performer, isn't she? Quite a bold choice for someone like you. Tell me, is she an investment or just a diversion? Elias's jaw tightened. That's none of your concern. Maybe not, Beckett said, his tone casual but laced with malice. But you know how the media loves a good story. A wealthy CEO, a struggling artist. It practically writes itself. And imagine if someone were to dig a little deeper into her past. What might they find? Elias's stomach twisted, though he refused to let it show. Are you threatening me, Beckett? Beckett's smile widened. Threatening? No. I'm just offering some friendly advice. People in your position can't afford distractions, Elias, especially ones with such colorful histories. Elias leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Stay out of my business. Whatever you think you know, it won't work. Beckett stood, straightening his jacket. Suit yourself, but be careful who you trust, Elias. Sometimes even the brightest smiles hide the darkest secrets. With that, he walked out, leaving Elias seething in silence. That evening, Elias returned to the mansion, his mind a storm of doubts. As he entered the music room, he found Marley and Daisy laughing over a clumsy attempt to balance the violin bow. For a moment, the tension in his chest eased, but Beckett's words echoed in his mind, planting a seed of suspicion he couldn't ignore. When the session ended, Elias stopped Marley as she packed up her violin. Can we talk? He asked, his tone unreadable. Marley hesitated but nodded. Daisy skipped off happily, leaving the two adults alone. Elias studied her for a moment, his expression guarded. I've been hearing things about you, he said finally. Rumors. Marley's eyes narrowed, her hands pausing on the violin case. Rumors? She repeated, her voice sharp. About your past, Elias clarified. People are starting to ask questions, and I need to know if there's anything I should be worried about. Marley's posture stiffened, her gaze hardening. Worried? She said, her voice rising slightly. You think I'm some kind of liability? That's not what Elias began, but Marley cut him off. No, it's exactly what you mean, she snapped. Let me save you the trouble. My past isn't a secret, Elias. It's messy, yes, but it's mine. And if you're looking for someone perfect to sit in your perfect house, you've got the wrong person. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, and for a moment, he didn't know how to reply. Marley slung her violin case over her shoulder, her eyes blazing with anger and hurt. I'm here for Daisy, she said firmly. Not for you, and definitely not for your approval. She walked out before he could stop her, leaving Elias alone in the empty room. He stared at the door she just slammed, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to believe her, but Beckett's warning loomed large in his mind. Unbeknownst to either of them, Beckett wasn't finished. His scheme had only just begun. The grand ballroom shimmered under the golden glow of chandeliers, the air heavy with the scent of roses and expensive cologne. Elias stood near the entrance, his sharp suit impeccable as he greeted guests. The charity gala was one of the most significant events on his calendar, a night designed to showcase the Hartwell Foundation's philanthropic endeavors. Yet his focus remained fractured, his gaze flicking toward the door every few moments. Marley arrived a little later than expected, her nerves apparent in the hesitant way she stepped inside. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, borrowed from her friend Elena, and carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the stares that followed her. She clutched her violin case tightly, her lifeline in an unfamiliar world. Daisy spotted her first, darting through the crowd to grab Marley's hand. You look so pretty, she exclaimed, her joy infectious. Marley smiled, relaxing slightly as she bent down to hug the girl. Elias approached them, his expression guarded. You're here, he said simply, his voice unreadable. You asked me to perform, Marley replied, lifting her chin. I said I would, he nodded curtly. The stage is ready. After dinner, you'll play. The evening unfolded smoothly at first. Marley stayed near Daisy, the girl's enthusiasm shielding her from the awkwardness of the high society crowd. Elias, ever the consummate host, moved through the room with practiced ease, though he glanced in Marley's direction more often than he intended. As dinner concluded, the hum of conversation dimmed, and Elias took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight," he began, his deep voice commanding the room. "Our work at the Heartwell Foundation is only possible because of your generosity. Tonight, we have a special performance, someone who has brought light into places I never thought could be reached." Marley stiffened at his words, a flush creeping up her neck. She caught his gaze, but his expression was unreadable. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage and positioned her violin under her chin. The first note cut through the air, silencing the room. Marley's music told a story of longing and resilience, weaving emotions too deep for words. For a brief shining moment, the room belonged to her, every soul enraptured by the raw beauty of her performance. Then a voice cut through the applause. "Impressive for someone with her background." The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Marley froze, her bow hovering mid-stroke. The crowd murmured, heads turning toward the source. Jonathan Beckett, standing near the bar with a glass of scotch in hand and a smug grin on his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" someone asked. Beckett shrugged theatrically. "Oh, I'm just saying, Marley Finn, isn't it? Street performer turned social climber? Fascinating rise. Makes you wonder how much of it's real." The murmurs grew louder, whispers rippling through the crowd. Marley's heart pounded as she stared at Beckett, her hands trembling. She could feel their eyes on her, curious, judgmental, piercing through the thin armor she had carefully built. Elias stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "That's enough, Beckett," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the noise. But Beckett only smirked. "Come now, Elias. Surely transparency is important at an event like this. Don't you think your guests deserve to know the full story?" Beckett gestured toward Marley. "Or is this just another one of your pet projects?" Marley felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The humiliation was suffocating, and the weight of Beckett's words crushed whatever composure she had left. She glanced at Elias, hoping for a sign of support, but his hesitation was like a knife to the heart. Daisy's small voice broke the silence. "She's not a project," she said fiercely, clutching Marley's hand. "She's my friend." The innocence of the statement cut through the tension, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage. Marley gently pulled her hand free, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I think I've played enough for tonight," she whispered, her voice shaking. Without another word, she stepped off the stage, her head held high despite the tremor in her legs. The crowd parted as she walked toward the exit, their whispers following her like shadows. Elias stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. Beckett's smirk remained, victorious and cruel, but Elias didn't care. His gaze was fixed on the door Marley had just walked through, a sickening realization settling in his chest. He had let her down. The rain returned that night, drumming against the windows of the Heartwell mansion. The house felt heavier, weighed down by the tension lingering from the charity gala. Elias sat in his study, nursing a glass of bourbon, his jaw tight as Beckett's cruel words replayed in his mind. But it wasn't Beckett's venom that haunted him most. It was the look in Marley's eyes as she walked out, her dignity battered, her trust broken. Down the hall, Daisy sat curled on her bed, clutching her sketch pad. Her small fingers traced the outline of a drawing she had made earlier that day. Marley standing under the lamppost at Pike Place Market, her violin glowing softly under a rainy sky. She glanced at the door, listening for the familiar sound of her father's footsteps, but the house was silent. Her chest tightened. She had seen how Marley looked at her father tonight, hoping he would defend her, and he didn't. Daisy's heart ached in a way that felt too big for her little frame to carry. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The rain glistened under the streetlights, and in the distance, the world beyond the gates of the mansion beckoned. Without hesitation, she grabbed her raincoat, tucked her sketchpad under her arm, and slipped out of the room. By the time Elias noticed Daisy's absence, it was nearly midnight. Panic shot through him as he checked her room, the kitchen, and even the music room. "Daisy," he called, his voice echoing through the house, but there was no answer. A frantic search revealed the open side gate. His heart pounded as dread clawed at him. He grabbed his car keys and bolted out the door, dialing security as he went. "Find her!" he barked. "Check the roads, the market, anywhere she might go." Meanwhile, Daisy trudged through the rain-soaked streets, her small feet carrying her toward the only place she could think of, Marley's apartment. She remembered the address Marley had written down during one of their lessons, and though she didn't fully understand the city's maze-like streets, her determination was unshakable. When she reached Marley's building, her fingers were numb from the cold. She buzzed the intercom, her voice trembling as she said, "Marley, it's me, Daisy." Marley, startled by the faint voice, rushed to the window and saw the small figure huddled in the rain. "Daisy?" she exclaimed, yanking the door open and rushing downstairs. Moments later, Daisy was in Marley's arms, her soaked coat dripping onto the apartment floor. Marley knelt before her, brushing wet strands of hair from Daisy's face. "What are you doing here? Does your father know?" Daisy shook her head, her lower lip trembling. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "You're the only one who listens to me." Marley's heart twisted painfully. She wrapped a blanket around Daisy and sat her on the couch, kneeling in front of her. "Daisy, you can't just run off like that. Your dad is probably worried sick." Daisy's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't stand up for you," she said, her voice breaking. "He just let that man say those awful things, and you left. You always leave." The words cut deep, but Marley swallowed the sting, pulling Daisy into a gentle hug. "Sometimes leaving feels like the only choice," she murmured. "But it doesn't mean I wanted to." Elias arrived at the building minutes later, his face pale and rain-soaked. Marley opened the door before he could knock, and his eyes immediately locked on Daisy. Relief and anger warred within him as he stepped inside. "Daisy," he said sharply, "what were you thinking? Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to—" "I had to see Marley," Daisy cried, cutting him off. "You don't understand. You just sit there and let people hurt her. You don't care." The accusation struck Elias like a physical blow. His anger deflated as he crouched to meet Daisy's tearful gaze. "That's not true," he said softly. "I care about you more than anything in the world." "Then why didn't you say something?" Daisy demanded. "Why didn't you help her?" Elias's throat tightened, the weight of his failure crushing him. He glanced at Marley, who stood silently nearby, her expression unreadable. "You're right," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have, and I'm sorry." Daisy sniffled, clinging to Marley's hand. Marley's gaze softened as she looked at Elias, seeing the cracks in his polished exterior. "She's safe now," Marley said quietly. "That's what matters." Elias nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Thank you," he murmured, "for taking care of her." As Marley watched them leave, Daisy's small hand clasped in Elias's. She felt an ache in her chest she couldn't quite name. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as her heart warred with her better judgment. The connection she felt with Daisy and even Elias was becoming harder to ignore. The morning after Daisy's escape dawned gray and heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Elias sat in his home office, staring blankly at his computer screen. Papers were strewn across his desk, contracts, spreadsheets, schedules, but none of them could hold his focus. The events of the previous night looped endlessly in his mind. Daisy's tearful accusations, Marley's quiet strength, and his own glaring failures. With a sigh, Elias leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. For years, he had prided himself on control over his business, his reputation, and even his emotions. But now, that control felt like a distant memory. He glanced at his phone, his thumb hovering over Marley's contact number. He wanted to call, to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Laura, stepped inside, holding a slim folder. "Mr. Hartwell," she began hesitantly. "The private investigator's report just came in." Elias frowned, a flicker of apprehension tightening his chest. He had hired the investigator days ago, spurred by Beckett's insinuations about Marley's past. At the time, it had seemed necessary, practical. Now, he wasn't so sure. "Leave it on the desk," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Laura nodded, placing the folder carefully in front of him before leaving. Elias stared at it for a long moment, his jaw clenching. Finally, with deliberate movements, he opened it. The first page was a brief summary of Marley's life, her years in foster care, her early passion for music, and the string of odd jobs she had taken to survive. But as Elias read on, the details grew darker. The file spoke of a young woman who had endured more hardship than most people could imagine: abandonment, poverty, betrayal by those she trusted most. One paragraph in particular stood out, its words like a punch to the gut. Marley had given up a scholarship to a prestigious music academy to protect her younger foster brother Russell when he fell into trouble. She had worked 3 jobs to pay off his debts, sacrificing her dreams in the process. Elias closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He thought of Marley's defiance, the fire in her eyes when she had defended herself at the gala. She wasn't hiding a sordid past, she was surviving it. And in his blindness, he had allowed Beckett's poison to seep into his own judgment. The sound of laughter drifted down the hall, pulling Elias from his thoughts. He followed it to the music room where Daisy was playing an imaginary violin, her movements mirroring Marley's. The sight brought a lump to his throat. "Daddy," Daisy called, noticing him in the doorway. "Look, I'm just like Marley!" Elias forced a smile, stepping into the room. "You're doing great, sweetheart." Daisy tilted her head, her expression turning serious. "Is Marley coming back?" Elias hesitated, his chest tightening. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I hope so." "Why wouldn't she?" Daisy asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "She likes us." Elias knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said softly. "And when they do, they have to work hard to fix them." Daisy seemed to consider this, her small brow furrowing. "Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to try," Elias promised, his voice firm. He kissed the top of her head before standing, determination settling in his chest. Later that afternoon, Elias found himself at Pike Place Market. The familiar bustle of vendors and street performers surrounded him, but his focus was singular. He scanned the crowd, searching for Marley. When he finally spotted her, she was seated on a bench near the edge of the market, her violin case at her feet. She wasn't playing, just staring out at the gray waves of Puget Sound. Elias approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant. Marley looked up as he neared, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Marley," he began, his voice steady, "I owe you an apology." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "For what exactly? For doubting me? For not standing up for me? Or for hiring someone to dig into my life?" Elias winced, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "All of it," he said honestly. "I was wrong about everything. I let my fears, my pride get in the way, and you paid the price." Marley studied him for a long moment, her silence heavy. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter. "You don't get to erase what happened with a few nice words, Elias." "I know," he replied, "but I'm not here to erase it. I'm here to make it right, if you'll let me." Marley's gaze softened slightly, though the walls around her heart remained firmly in place. "That's a big if," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. Elias nodded. "Then I'll earn it." For the first time in days, Marley allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The mansion was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural in such a large home. Marley had just finished another session with Daisy, the little girl's giggles still echoing faintly in the air as she skipped out of the music room. Marley packed her violin into its case, her movements methodical. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Elias to appear as he often did after Daisy's lessons, but the hallway remained empty. As she fastened the latches on her case, a faint shuffle of footsteps drew her attention. One of the housemaids, a young woman named Clara, lingered at the doorway. Her expression was hesitant, almost nervous. "Miss Finn," Clara began, her voice quiet. There's something I need to tell you." Marley frowned, standing up straight. "What is it?" Clara hesitated, wringing her hands. "It's about Mr. Beckett. He was here earlier, and he was asking questions about you." Marley's chest tightened. "Beckett, what kind of questions?" "About your past," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he said some things to Mr. Hartwell. I don't know what exactly, but it sounded bad." Marley felt the floor shift beneath her. a familiar dread creeping into her chest. She nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you, Clara. I appreciate you letting me know." Clara gave her a sympathetic look before disappearing down the hall. Marley stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. What was Beckett up to now? And why was Elias allowing him anywhere near the house? The answer came quicker than she expected. The sound of Elias's sharp footsteps echoed in the hall, his figure appearing in the doorway moments later. His face was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that set Marley immediately on edge. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. Marley crossed her arms, bracing herself. "What's this about?" Elias stepped further into the room, his gaze steady but cold. "I found something in your belongings." Marley's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, dropping it onto the table. A glittering diamond necklace spilled out, its delicate chain catching the light. Marley's stomach sank. "That's not mine," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "Clara found it in your violin case," Elias said, his tone accusatory. "It was reported missing this morning. Care to explain?" Marley stared at the necklace, her mind racing. "I didn't take it," she said, her voice rising. "Why would I? You think I'd risk everything for... what, a necklace?" Elias's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what to think, Marley. First Beckett shows up, now this. I trusted you." The words struck like a physical blow. Marley took a step back, her chest tightening. "So that's it? You're just going to believe him? Believe this over me?" Elias hesitated, but his silence spoke volumes. Marley's voice broke as she continued, her emotions spilling over. "I thought you were different, Elias. I thought you actually saw me, not just my past, but I guess I was wrong." "Marley, if you didn't take it, then don't," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "Don't try to justify this. You've already made up your mind." She grabbed her violin case and brushed past him, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. "Tell Daisy I'm sorry," she said quietly before walking out the door. Elias stood frozen, the weight of his actions sinking in too late. He glanced down at the necklace, doubt creeping into his mind. Something about the situation felt off. Hours later, Clara approached him again, her face pale. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice trembling. I think we made a mistake." Elias's heart dropped as she explained Beckett's role in the incident. The bribe, the planted evidence, the manipulation. Realization dawned cold and heavy. Without hesitation, Elias grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He had to fix this before it was too late. Elias gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated through the dimly lit streets, his mind racing with Clara's revelation. The necklace, the one he had so blindly used as evidence against Marley, was planted by Beckett. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth, his own arrogance now glaringly clear. He had doubted her, allowed himself to be manipulated, and in doing so, he had driven away the one person who had brought light back into his daughter's life. He pulled up to Marley's apartment, the building a stark contrast to the elegance of his mansion. Rain began to fall as he stepped out of the car, cold droplets soaking through his coat. He knocked on the door, each second of silence stretching unbearably. Finally, it opened. Marley stood there, her eyes puffy and red but sharp with anger. She didn't need to speak. Her gaze said it all. Elias cleared his throat, his voice low. "I need to talk to you." "No," she said firmly, beginning to close the door. "Wait." Elias's hand shot out, stopping the door just before it clicked shut. "I know I was wrong about everything, and I need to make it right." Marley hesitated, her grip on the door tightening. "What exactly do you think you can fix, Elias? You accused me of stealing. You let that man humiliate me. And then you..." Her voice cracked, but she quickly composed herself. "You didn't even give me a chance to defend myself." Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You're right. I didn't. I was blinded by fear, by Beckett's lies, by my own pride. But I know the truth now, Marley. Clara told me everything." Marley's eyes narrowed. "So Clara absolved me and now you think everything's fine?" "No," Elias said quickly, his voice pleading. "I know it's not fine. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I'm here because I want to try. Please, Marley, just hear me out." Marley hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was small but warm, cluttered with sheet music and the faint smell of coffee. Elias stood awkwardly, his presence a stark contrast to the cozy space. Marley crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Talk." Elias took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the weight of his words. "I've spent years building walls, protecting myself, controlling everything around me. And for a long time, I thought that made me strong. But you..." He looked at her, his voice faltering. "You showed me that strength isn't about control. It's about trust. And I failed to trust you when it mattered most." Marley blinked, her expression softening slightly, though the hurt in her eyes remained. "Why now, Elias? Why does it matter so much to you to fix this?" "Because of Daisy," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "She sees you as someone special, and she's right. You've given her something I couldn't, a reason to smile again. And in doing that, you've given me something I didn't even know I needed." Marley turned away, her arms dropping to her sides. She stared out the rain-streaked window, her thoughts a storm of anger, doubt, and something else, something she didn't want to name yet. Elias stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Marley. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking you, begging you, not to walk away from Daisy. She needs you, and so do I." Marley closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She turned back to face him, her voice steady but quiet. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Elias. I'll earn it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Marley let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping. "This isn't just about you, Elias. It's about Daisy. I'll keep teaching her, but I need time to figure out the rest." Elias nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you." As he left the apartment, the rain still falling, Elias felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure if it was redemption or simply the beginning of it, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The grand hall of the city's cultural center hummed with anticipation. The charity concert, organized on short notice, had become a last-ditch effort by Elias to repair the damage he had caused. It wasn't just about clearing Marley's name. It was about showing her that he believed in her, that he was willing to fight for her the way she had fought her entire life. Marley stood backstage, clutching her violin case tightly. The hum of voices from the audience filtered through the heavy curtain, each word a reminder of the scrutiny she was about to face. She glanced at herself in the mirror, her reflection betraying the nerves that churned in her stomach. Elias appeared behind her, his presence a steadying force, though she didn't turn to look at him. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "If it's too much," Marley interrupted, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm not doing this for you, Elias." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I know." Before she could respond, Daisy ran into the room, her excitement uncontainable. "Marley, you look beautiful," she exclaimed, her small hands clutching a bouquet of daisies. "These are for you." Marley knelt to take the flowers, her smile softening. "Thank you, Daisy. They're perfect." The stage manager's voice called out, "2 minutes!" And Marley rose, her expression hardening as she turned back to the mirror. Elias hesitated, then placed a hand on Daisy's shoulder, gently guiding her toward the audience. "We'll be watching," he said quietly before leaving Marley alone. When the curtain rose, the room fell silent. Marley stepped onto the stage, her violin glinting under the soft lights. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but as she looked out into the crowd, her gaze found Daisy's beaming face. And then, just beyond Elias, his expression full of something she hadn't expected. Pride. She took a deep breath, raising the violin to her chin. The first note cut through the silence, soft and tentative, like a question whispered in the dark. But as the melody grew, it swelled with emotion, grief, resilience, hope. Each note told a story, her story, and it reached into the hearts of everyone in the room. The audience was transfixed. Even the usual rustling and murmurs of large gatherings had ceased. Marley's bow danced across the strings, her movements fluid and powerful. The music shifted, dipping into a haunting refrain before rising into a triumphant crescendo, that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. As the final note faded, the silence lingered for a heartbeat before the room erupted into applause. Marley lowered her violin, her chest heaving as the sound washed over her. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the look on Daisy's face, the tears glistening in her eyes, and the way Elias rose to his feet, clapping with a fervor that seemed to transcend the moment. The curtain fell, and Marley stepped backstage, her legs trembling. She barely had time to catch her breath before Elias and Daisy appeared. Daisy rushed forward, throwing her arms around Marley's waist. "You were amazing!" she cried, her voice full of wonder. Elias followed more slowly, his gaze steady. "You didn't just play," he said, his voice low. "You healed something in that room tonight, in all of us." Marley hesitated, her walls still half raised. "What do you want from me, Elias?" "Nothing," he replied simply. "I wanted to give you a stage to tell your story, and you did. You don't owe me anything." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment she searched his face, looking for cracks in his resolve, but there were none. Finally she nodded, her own voice softening. "Thank you for believing in me." He smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through the tension that had defined their relationship. "You make it easy." Daisy tugged at Marley's hand, her excitement spilling over. "Can we go get ice cream to celebrate, please?" Marley laughed, the sound light and unguarded for the first time in what felt like forever. She glanced at Elias, who gave a small nod. "All right, kiddo," Marley said, taking Daisy's hand. "Ice cream it is." As they left the theater together, the city lights shimmering around them, Marley felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a sense of belonging. The rain was relentless, drenching the city in a silvery haze that blurred the edges of buildings and cast soft reflections across the streets. Marley walked briskly through Pike Place Market, her violin case strapped securely to her back. The familiar cobblestones beneath her feet felt grounding, even as her thoughts raced. It had been days since the concert, and while Elias's words of gratitude lingered in her mind, she couldn't shake the vulnerability that came with trusting him. Daisy had melted her walls easily, but Elias? He was different, complex, guarded, yet slowly unraveling before her eyes, and that scared her. She paused near the lamppost where she'd first played for Daisy. Rain streamed off her hood, and she tilted her face upward, letting the cool droplets calm her. The violin was her sanctuary, but tonight it felt too heavy to play. Instead, she stood in the rain, her breath steady, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. "Marley." The voice startled her. She turned to see Elias standing a few feet away, his coat soaked through and his hair plastered to his forehead. He was out of place here, his tailored clothing clashing with the market's gritty charm. But his expression, a mixture of determination and something deeper, made her heart stutter. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. Elias stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Looking for you." Marley raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "In the rain? At night? Seems dramatic even for you." Elias managed a faint smile, but it quickly faded. "I had to see you. I couldn't let things go unsaid," she sighed, her defenses rising instinctively. "Elias, we've been through this. You said what you needed to say at the concert, and I'm grateful. But..." "No," he interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "That wasn't enough. Gratitude isn't enough, Marley." Her breath hitched as he stepped closer, the rain pouring around them. "What are you trying to say?" Elias hesitated, his expression raw. "You've changed everything for me. Daisy, my life, even how I see myself. I've spent so long trying to control everything, to keep people at a distance because it was easier than risking this." "This?" Marley echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caring," Elias admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "You made me care, Marley, about you, about what you've been through, what you've overcome. And I've never felt more terrified in my life." Marley stared at him, her heart pounding. The rain soaked through her clothes, but she barely felt it. "You're scared?" she said, a faint laugh escaping her. "You think you're the only one?" Elias frowned. "Marley, no, let me finish," she said, her voice firm. "You don't know how many times I've wanted to run, to pack up and disappear before anyone could hurt me again, trusting you, letting you and Daisy into my life. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm still figuring out if it's worth it. Elias stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. It's worth it. I promise you, it's worth it. Her breath caught as he reached out, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment she hesitated, her instincts warring with the undeniable pull between them. Then slowly, she let her hand slip into his, the warmth of his touch grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. I don't know if I can promise you anything, she said quietly. I don't even know if I can promise myself. Elias nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. Then don't. Just stay. Let me show you that I'm not going anywhere. The rain continued to fall, but the world around them seemed to fade. Marley looked up at him, her heart heavy and full all at once. You're stubborn, she said, a small smile breaking through her defenses. And you're impossible, Elias countered, his own smile softening the sharp edges of his face. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marley let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find something worth holding on to, together. The warm glow of the concert hall wrapped the audience like a soft embrace, the air thick with anticipation. Marley adjusted the violin beneath her chin, her fingers steady on the strings. The lights dimmed, focusing entirely on her, and the faint murmur of the crowd faded into an expectant hush. Tonight was unlike any performance she'd ever given. Tonight was hers, a culmination of everything she'd fought for, everything she'd risked. Daisy sat in the front row, her small hands clasped together tightly, her face glowing with excitement. Elias was beside her, his expression softer than Marley had ever seen. The once imposing man now looked like someone who had learned how to let go, and in doing so, had gained far more than he'd lost. Marley took a deep breath and let the bow glide across the strings. The first notes rose, soft and unassuming, carrying the room into a world only she could create. Each stroke of the bow was deliberate, each note infused with the emotion she could never fully put into words. She played for the pain of her past, the resilience that had carried her through, and the tentative hope that had been ignited in the storm of her connection with Elias and Daisy. The melody shifted, building into a crescendo that filled the space with life and longing. The audience leaned forward, captivated, but Marley's gaze remained fixed on Daisy. The little girl's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her joy palpable. Marley felt her chest tighten, not with nerves but with something far more profound: belonging. As the piece drew to a close, Marley let the final note linger, fading into a silence so profound it felt as though the world itself had paused to listen. Then, the room erupted in applause, the sound rolling over her like a wave. She stood still for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in, before stepping forward to take a bow. Elias rose first, his hands coming together in a slow, deliberate clap. Daisy followed, her tiny frame bursting with excitement as she cheered loudly. Soon the entire hall was on its feet, the ovation thundering. For the first time in years, Marley allowed herself to bask in the admiration, not as a street performer scraping by, but as a musician who had found her voice. Backstage, the atmosphere buzzed with congratulations from other performers and patrons, but Marley's focus remained singular. She barely had time to take a breath before Daisy came running toward her, her arms flinging around Marley's waist. "You were amazing," Daisy said, her voice full of awe. Marley knelt to her level, smoothing a strand of hair from Daisy's face. "Thank you, kiddo. Your cheering might have been the best part." Elias approached slowly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes carried a warmth Marley had grown to recognize. "You did more than play tonight," he said, his voice low but steady. "You told a story, your story, and everyone here felt it." Marley met his gaze, her own softening. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted, surprising even herself. "Without both of you." Daisy tugged on Marley's hand, looking up at Elias with a mischievous smile. "Does this mean Marley can come live with us now?" Marley froze, her eyes darting to Elias. For a moment, his composure faltered, but then he crouched to Daisy's level, his tone gentle. "That's up to Marley," he said, "but she'll always be a part of our lives, no matter what." Marley felt her walls crumbling piece by piece under the weight of their shared vulnerability. She had spent so long running, so long shielding herself from the world. But now, she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. "I think," Marley said slowly, her gaze flicking between them, "we might have to find a bigger music room." Daisy squealed with delight, throwing her arms around Marley again. Elias stood, his lips curving into a smile that held no pretense, only gratitude. That night, as they left the concert hall together, Marley felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new symphony, one built on trust, love, and the promise of something neither she nor Elias had dared to believe in before. The morning sunlight streamed through the large bay window of the Heartwell music room, casting golden streaks on the polished wood floors. Daisy sat cross-legged with a violin balanced carefully in her lap, her small fingers hovering over the strings. Marley knelt beside her, guiding her hands with soft encouragement. "Remember, the music starts here," Marley said, gently tapping Daisy's chest. "It's not just about playing notes. It's about telling a story." Daisy nodded earnestly, her brow furrowed in concentration as she lifted the bow. The first note was hesitant, wobbling slightly, but Marley smiled, hearing more than just the sound. It was hope. Daisy beamed up at her, her confidence growing with each stroke of the bow. From the doorway, Elias watched in silence. His usual reserved demeanor softened as he took in the scene. Marley glanced over her shoulder, catching him watching, and for the first time he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that said more than words ever could. "You're improving, Daisy," Marley said softly as the note trailed off. "You'll be a violinist before you know it." Daisy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I want to play with you someday, like a real concert." Marley chuckled. "One day, kiddo." As Daisy scampered off to show her progress to the housemaid, Elias stepped further into the room, his shoes barely making a sound against the floor. "You've done more for her than I ever could," he admitted quietly, his gaze steady on Marley. "You've given her a reason to dream again." Marley stood, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "She already had dreams, Elias. She just needed someone to believe in them." "And what about you?" Elias asked, his voice careful. "Who's believing in you?" Marley hesitated, her walls wavering but still not entirely down. "I'm learning to believe in myself." Elias closed the distance between them, his voice softer now. "You don't have to do it alone, Marley. You never did." For a long moment she studied his face, searching for the doubts she was so used to seeing in others. But there were none, only honesty, only him. "You and Daisy," Marley started, her voice breaking slightly. "You've changed me too." Elias reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Maybe we've changed each other." Marley let the words sink in, the weight of her fears finally beginning to lift. She nodded, her smile soft and real. "Maybe." Outside, the sound of Daisy's laughter filtered through the window, blending with the distant hum of the city. Marley looked down at the violin case resting in the corner, and then at Elias, whose grip on her hand felt steady, unshakable. "This feels like the start of something," Marley murmured, almost to herself. Elias nodded, his voice low. "A new beginning, for all of us." As the sunlight bathed the room in its golden glow, Marley allowed herself to believe that she had finally found a place she could call home. Not a place of walls and roofs, but of trust, love, and music. It was a melody of hope, one she knew she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. What do you think of Marley and Elias's journey? Do you agree with their actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. From 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. Don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.